Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special Breakthrough Live with me, Rania Khalek, and my lovely co host, Zoe Alexandra, who is coming to us from Minneapolis. Zoe, thank you for braving the cold and tear gas to join us today.
Yeah, of course. I think we have a lot to talk about.
So Zoe, you've been on the Zoe's been on the ground for Breakthrough News, and she's also the editor of People's Dispatch, reporting. And we're going to be talking today about some more horrific news, but also some inspiring protests outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and increasingly spreading across the country in the wake of more terrorism against average citizens from ICE after the second street execution caught on camera over the weekend, this time of Alex Pretti, a 37-year-old nurse who was shot, I think, Zoe, it was 10 times. Just a shocking, blatant execution. This came about 2.5 weeks after the street execution of Renee Good, also, I believe, 37 years old. A Minneapolis local. This has been happening in the wake of Trump administration dispatching ICE and Customs and Border Control into the city and other areas of the U.S. to carry out these really frightening raids, and also then to, assault protesters essentially as they rise up against this increasingly brutal policing by Trump's almost personal militia at this point. So we're going to be talking about all that. We've got some things me and Zoe will be talking about, covering different angles of it. We've also got 3 really great guests. We're going to be hearing about what's going on the ground in Minneapolis, how it connects to the politics of it all, what's happening in Congress to address this, what, if anything, are the Democrats doing. We're going to be talking about the imperial boomerang aspect of this. We're going to be talking about how this is spreading across the country, culminating in a potential or a coming sort of strike or shutdown this Friday, January 30th. Zoe, before we get to our first guest, I want to remind everybody that we are, of course, an independent media outlet here at Breakthrough News, meaning we don't get money from corporations. That means weapons companies, pharmaceutical companies, not funding us. We get our funding from our viewers, our audience. So if you appreciate what we do here at Breakthrough News, we're always on the ground covering protests like what's going on in Minneapolis, which we're there now. We're also, constantly bringing you shows about geopolitical stuff happening all around the globe. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, where you can help support independent media and also access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. Make sure if you don't have the money to spend, make sure at the very least you're subscribed to Breakthrough News. Make sure you hit the bell so you get notifications when we have new content coming out. And make sure you smash that like button, you guys.
Smash that like button.
Love that. Zoe, is that the first time you've heard that? You look surprised.
Yeah, I know it is the first time I've heard that. So I am. I
When you're
usually
in
hear
studio,
it.
you can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're in studio, you can't hear John play it. But yeah, that's me saying smash that like button. John's got it on record. Smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. With all that said, I want to jump right into our first guest. We've got with us Meghdad Bose, an independent journalist and professor of journalism at the University of Memphis, who has also contributed reporting to Breakthrough News while he's been on the ground in Minneapolis. Meghdad, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also now I know how to pronounce the name of the audio Bose. I didn't realize that's how you pronounced it, but now, because we were asking you how to pronounce your last name, and you were like the way they pronounce the headphones, but not connected, I assume. No affiliation?
No, it is. I mean, not a relative, but it is the same last name. We're both Bengali.
Oh, well, look at that. Maybe it is a relative. Maybe you should stake a claim on it. But no, in all seriousness, you have been closely tracking the fallout from the killings of both Renee Good and then Alex Pretti and the general strike. You've been on the ground. You've seen ICE and Customs and Border Patrol in action. Tell us, what's the vibe on the ground right now, politically, emotionally, in terms of momentum around this issue?
When I was there in Minneapolis, the terror on the streets and in the neighborhoods is very hard to describe. I think one thing the journalists are struggling with is just putting into words and visuals the fear that is sort of palpable but hard to describe, right? Like, what do you say when immigrant families are too afraid to not just go out to work, not just go out to get groceries and daily essentials, but even like go to like their just outside their door when someone's getting groceries for them? What do you say about people who are afraid to open the doors of their homes to even accept those essentials that mutual aid groups are getting to them, right? And while that is going on, and the Trump administration obviously sees that Minneapolis, the community in Minneapolis is sort of bonding together in ways that are incredible. And they're going so hard after protesters who are standing up for their immigrant neighbors, because often the immigrants aren't able to come out and protest for themselves, for their own rights. And we've seen those escalations, by the way, something that a lot of places aren't sort of highlighting. There was a federal court order that prevented, that said that federal agents are not supposed to be using tear gas and chemical munitions at peaceful protesters on the streets. They violated that federal order pretty much every single day of the week. Greg Bovino now, who's supposed to be out of his role that he had in Minneapolis, was on camera saying gas, 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 and throwing gas at people, right? Like, you were literally prevented by a federal court from doing that to peaceful protesters. And then we saw the killing of Alex Pretti, a registered nurse at a veterans hospital, and you saw the way in which that happened. I mean, I spent hours and hours on Saturday and Sunday just watching those videos from different angles in slow motion and regular pace, zoomed in and zoomed out hundreds and hundreds of times. But the reason we did that was because what we were seeing was just hard to even believe. There were multiple shots. First of all, a federal agent disarmed the gun from Pretty's back before they fired the first shot at him. What was that shot fired for? Second, like you said, there were 10 gunshots fired at him. 10. Several of them were from a distance away. They were firing at the still lifeless body of Alex Pretti like a firing squad. They went on and on and on, right? I mean, the third and the fourth shots you can see are towards his back, seemingly towards his back. You can see his head facing the video being filmed by that person in the pink jacket. And you can see that they just keep moving back. The agents keep moving back and keeping on firing. And you see something as indefensible as that crime. And what does the Trump administration do? The first thing they do is blame Alex Pretti, blame Democrats. And which is why I just want to end before like sort of hearing more from you, is that I know it feels to a lot of people who've been protesting and who've been speaking up against this, that the removal of Greg Bovino from Minneapolis seems like a huge victory. And while sure, it can be said to be an impact of like the people's pressure on the administration, it is far from what justice should look like. I mean, the very least that Greg Bovino, who was in charge of the CBP agents, as those CBP agents killed a US citizen on the streets in broad daylight, and an unarmed, harmless US citizen who had just gone to check on a woman who was being gassed, who was being thrown to the ground, to the very least should be that he gets removed from his job. But that is injustice. That isn't even close to being a semblance of what justice should look like.
I think that's a very well taken point, Meghdad. And I think interestingly, you know, the response of the Trump administration has been so atrocious to just, you know, continue to stigmatize protesters, to continue to try to criminalize them, even while they're literally shooting them dead. It's easy for Democrats to actually look good and maybe have like what we could call a firmer response. But, you know, that hasn't always been the case. How have Democrats responded so far on a local scale, but also nationally? And do you get the sense that their statements and their actions are actually matching the scale of what's happening, or do people feel like it's falling short?
Yeah. And I think there are two things I'd like to say here. One is that Democrats often look better in comparison to Republicans, right? Because Republicans are just siding with the Trump administration no matter what they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing a good enough job, right? And those two things can be separate. And when people criticize Democrats for falling short, that doesn't mean that they're siding with what the Republicans are doing, right? And we reported on this for Breakthrough. There were people who were saying, wait, what are the Democrats in office actually doing? And let's look at this at different levels, right? Let's look at Congress, let's look at the Democratic leadership, and then let's look at Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry, et cetera, right? Like the local leadership. You look at Congress, they've been debating whether they should like consider stopping giving billions more to DHS and ICE. How is that? Like, to think that that is where the Democratic Party sort of Overton window is, that that's the debate that they're having. And we saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez thank the Senate Dems profusely for saying that they're going to sort of not support that bill through. That's should be the barest of bare minimums at this point, given the evidence that we're seeing on the streets, right? And a lot of people would feel that when you'd feel that it's justified for them to feel that way, that should be the barest of bare minimums. So there is that feeling that congressional Democrats really haven't stepped up in the way that people would like them, and that Minnesotans on the ground would like them to. I spoke to lots of Minnesotans, average residents in Minneapolis, protesters out on the streets outside NICE facility at the Memorial for Renee Good. And a lot of them had that to say, that they say the right words, that these leaders say the right words, but what are they actually doing? So let's list down some concrete things that we heard from people in Minnesota as to what they'd like. Number one, businesses, small businesses, immigrant-owned businesses are reeling from losses that are amounting to thousands and thousands of dollars. We reported on a small business owner, on a restaurant owner who'd spent 10 years saving up to start her dream restaurant. And it had been only a month, only weeks that she'd opened that restaurant before Trump called his federal siege on her hometown of Minneapolis. And now she's earning next to no money. So one, can these immigrant businesses be supported is what we're hearing from organizers. Number two, people who aren't being able to go to work, a lot of people aren't being able to make money, right? They're not being able to get their daily wages. They're not being able to get paid their hourly wages. And so a lot of organizing groups like MIRAC, like others are calling, like the Minneapolis City Council too has called for an eviction moratorium, that this is the last situation where you want people to be evicted from their homes. When they are scared to get out of their homes, that's the last time you want them to be, the last situation you want them to be evicted in. So they're calling for an eviction moratorium, right? Again, something we're not seeing so far. They're calling for in a very meaningful way for the state authorities to say that when ICE agents or when federal agents break the law in observable manners, that they should be prosecuted, that they should potentially be arrested, right? And now Mayor Jacob Fry has said he doesn't want to see one law enforcement agency going against another. But what one protester outside the Memorial for Renee Good said, that would you like just allow someone else to murder someone on the streets and get away with it? You'd arrest them, right? And they're violating laws in all sorts of ways. For example, we've seen videos of federal agents kneeling on a person's head. Now, if you remember the way George Floyd died in the same city, a mile away from where Renee Good was killed on January 7th, there was a law introduced in Minnesota in 2020 that outlawed law enforcement officers from kneeling on someone's head. So when federal agents break those laws within the state of Minneapolis, right, there are legal experts saying, hey, you're breaking state laws, right? So what is the state doing about it? And so when it comes to economic support, when it comes to eviction moratoriums, when it comes to actual legal prosecutions and potential arrests, a lot of people I spoke to, a lot of organizers and protesters are saying that the Democrats are saying the right words, but don't have the right actions to follow up.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, the story of the Democrats in general is that last line you just said, unfortunately. But, I do wonder as there is increasing pressure and you are even seeing some Democrats get behind the idea of, they're not necessarily saying abolish ICE, except for like Zoran Mamdani, but he's a special case. But they are saying, let's not fund it, right? So I guess that brings me to my next question, which is, speaking of Congress, what real options exist right now to block or cut funding to ICE? And is pressure from the streets possibly going to shift what's politically possible for Democrats moving forward?
Yeah, I think there are two things here, right? Like if Democrats are saying that it's difficult to get the political momentum to call for the stopping of funding to DHS entirely, then who's responsible for building that momentum? Because we know that there's evidence on the streets and in the neighborhoods of these cities that are under siege of horrific atrocities being committed by federal agents, of laws being broken every day. So why is it not that why can't the Democrats go out and showcase that evidence, showcase those stories to the country at large? And there are some Democrats who've done like some efforts on that. So, for example, Rep. Pramila Jayapal went down to Minneapolis and along with Ilhan Omar did this sort of public hearing where people came forth and shared their testimonies. But we need to see more of that on a daily basis. We can't wait for a 5-year-old Liam Ramos to go viral because of how cute that kid looks in that little beanie he's got on, for people to realize that children are being arrested. Children are being arrested every other day. We need to hear their stories. And yes, the media has a huge responsibility on this part, but so do the elected representatives of gathering what's happening, not just for some faraway prosecution that like the state attorney general is doing. That's important too. But they need to be telling these stories to the people of this country. It's not just about Tim Walz coming out every couple of days and making a sort of a rhetorical statement about how ICE is separating families. Show us, talk to us about those stories, tell us those stories, and build the political momentum that can oppose the need to even say that you should be funding DHS. So Congress definitely, I mean, the Democrats in both houses in the House and the Senate, have a responsibility right now to the American people. And I mean American people broadly here, not just American citizens, but everyone residing in the United States of America, to stand up to this lawlessness that we're seeing. For example, Donald Trump every other day says that he's arresting criminals and rapists and murderers off the streets of Minnesota. Existing data from ICE itself, government data from this Trump administration, shows that that's not the case. And like we said in the previous episode on Breakthrough, that 44% of those arrested didn't have criminal records in Minnesota under this Trump administration till mid-October. So when Trump and his administration get around to like sort of lying through their teeth about what's happening, Democrats shouldn't be rejoicing at the piecemeal measures of like a Greg Bovino removed or some federal agents being removed. This is a city under complete siege. They shouldn't be okay with the city being under 75% or 60% siege.
It's really incredible. And it's also important to point out, Tom Homan was appointed by the Obama administration. He was appointed as Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Executive Associate Director of Enforcement and Removal Operations in 2013. So that Trump's border czar, who's now being sent to Minnesota, again, head of ICE and removal under Obama. So there is a bipartisan relationship here. And I'm not saying, the Democrats are responsible for exactly what Trump's doing now, but you couldn't have what Trump was doing without what Democrats have done. So it's always important to remember that there is a synergy here between these two parties when it comes to this horrific apparatus. Meghdad, I want to thank you for joining us and for your incredible reporting. People can go to breakthrough.news.org. We've published several of your reports from the ground in Minneapolis. We really appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
I mean, Zoe, it's horrifying that this just keeps escalating, and it starts to concern me. I mean, it's concerning to have these kinds of street executions taking place and getting more brutal with each one. But it's like, this is 2 in less than a month, right? And
Right.
at some point, if it continues to happen, it starts to become normal. It kind of makes you think of like the way Gaza and the horrors of it over time, because it kept happening and getting worse, became normal and people got used to it. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't want that to happen. But I just wanted to address something and then get your thoughts on this. Because, we hear the term imperial boomerang being thrown around, and we're going to be talking to our next guest about that. But I think this is a really, really important point to discuss, especially as people who are anti-imperialist, because this is the kind of brute force that's long been used in the colonized world. But now it's just being turned inwards, right? And you even had Stephen Miller announcing, after kidnapping Maduro in Venezuela, he announced that they would be ruling the world by force, that there is no international law. It's just a nicety, that this is basically the worldview of people in power now. So they're literally just doing the same thing that they do abroad at home. And they've already declared the people of the United States the enemy, who don't agree with them, that they're the enemy within. They're domestic terrorists. We heard Pam Bondi and Stephen Miller call both Renee Good and Alex Pretti terrorists. I think they were at one point saying that Alex Pretti was trying to assassinate law enforcement and had to be put down. Like, it was just completely insane the way they were framing this guy. But that might sound familiar, because that's the kind of label that you see them give to those they kill in the global South. Internationally, that label gives them a license to kill without any evidence at all. You just call someone a terrorist and it justifies executing them, whether it's, someone in the Middle East gets no due process, or some, fisherman on a boat in the Caribbean who's been denounced as a narco-terrorist with zero evidence. License to kill. And it was also used, by the way, that same kind of thing was used to justify a genocide in Gaza. And now we're seeing that used to justify street executions at home. And, in these cases, they'll invent crimes and they'll gaslight. They did that about Renee Good. They did that about Alex Pretti, right? A nurse at the freaking Veterans Affairs. Just as they'll fabricate similar lies about doctors and nurses in Gaza before, slaughtering them. And I think it's like really, really important, Zoe, to recognize that a government that claims the right to kidnap the president of another country and to kill anyone who stands in its way, of course, that same government is going to have no problem kidnapping, low-wage immigrant workers and killing people within its own borders who dissent from that policy. This is all part of the same imperialist system, right? It attacks all of us everywhere, not just in Latin America or in the Middle East. And it really should form the basis of a kind of unity for people around the world, and then people outraged who are inside of the US, because it's going, I think, unfortunately, it's going to get more brutal. The US is not okay right now. It's an empire in crisis. That's why it's attacking its own people, in addition to getting increasingly brutal internationally. Inequality right now is so extreme and so unjust. And we have a system, a capitalist system, that not just refuses to address it, but actually makes it worse, because its nature is to be incredibly greedy and to concentrate more and more capital in the hands of the few who rule us. And so instead, ruling elites are taking more and more while the rest of us fight over crumbs, and it's unsustainable. And so as more people push back, this ruling class is going to turn to fascistic policies to shut us up. And that means censorship. We're seeing, kidnappings of people who dissent, who are immigrants, and now street executions. And these were street executions, by the way, of white American citizens. Not that it's okay to do it to like the undocumented, but it's not even happening to the most vulnerable, right? So this kind of, violence and fear is increasingly the only way for them to uphold a system that everybody hates. And I have to say, Alex Pretti, the guy was a hero. He stood up for the vulnerable. He literally intervened when ICE was like assaulting a woman, and he got murdered for it. Same with Renee Good. She was intervening, against attacks in her neighborhood against vulnerable people. We can't allow this to become normal. We have to oppose it. We have to stand against it with the collective power that we have, and we have to recognize the foundation upon which it's built. Because if we don't recognize that, it's going to continue to get worse, and because we're not going to be able to understand how to address it properly.
No, I completely agree with you, Rania. And it was really interesting this past week being here in Minneapolis and speaking to, for example, a lot of members of the Somali community. I was at one of the big Somali malls just last night and speaking with a lot of the shop owners. Both Renee and Alex had visited this mall several times. A lot of them knew them, were familiar with them, and were really mourning it. And their response, I think, is something that should inspire us, which is that what's happening right now in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, is an attack on all people. And the only way to respond to that is with unity. Some really just like inspiring conversations with those people, because, this whole racist, xenophobic attack on the people of Minneapolis and Minnesota was, justified. And again, Ronnie, we were talking about this at the beginning of January. They attack Venezuela. They say it's about drug cartels. They go after people in Minnesota. They say it's about this massive fraud scheme. And I think the quickness with which they're inventing these completely ridiculous narratives, and like the firmness with which people are pushing back on them, is also revealing. And I think the Trump administration is in a corner more than it ever has been. And I think it's realizing that actually this wanton violence and these like very weak lies, honestly, like these weak narratives that they're unable to actually, because they're fake. I mean, these things, calling every single Somali person like a fraudster and a criminal, it's like people, they forget that people actually talk to each other and people actually know each other. It's like they're forgetting that we're like humans and have interactions and go to their businesses and people are a community. It's actually, I think, waking up the kind of multinational unity that hasn't existed in the United States in its history, and it maybe has existed in moments and has been quickly crushed. It's waking up that kind of unity, and I think it's a really powerful thing. And despite the cold here in Minneapolis, it has been extremely heartwarming to see that despite such brutal violence against immigrant communities, these street executions, the response really has been like the only thing we can do is band together and fight this.
Absolutely. And to continue this conversation, I want to go ahead, Zoe, and invite onto the program our next guest. We're very happy to be joined by Craig Mokhiber, longtime human rights lawyer, returning guest at Breakthrough New. Craig, it's so great to see you. Oh no, Craig's muted. I think that might be on our end. Let's see if we can fix that.
I'm unmuted now, I think.
There, we can hear you. We freed Craig. Craig, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you both again. Thank you.
Well, I'm really glad to get you on today, because you're, I think, the perfect person to address this. I want to bring it to the international law element, because that is your expertise. And we see members of the Trump administration are justifying this latest street execution in Minneapolis by labeling Alex Pretti a terrorist, an agitator, and trying to assassinate law enforcement. My electricity will come back on. It usually does. There we go. Sanctions, everyone. But going back to what I was saying, the Trump administration is justifying the street execution by labeling Alex Pretti as some sort of terrorist, an agitator, trying to assassinate law enforcement. I'm curious if you could maybe tell us from an international law perspective, how would you classify this kind of state violence, and what legal framework would apply here?
Well, it's interesting that the kind of language being deployed by the Trump administration is precisely the kind of language that has been used against its victims in the global South forever. That moniker of terrorism, for example, as a justification for any kind of gross violations of human rights is something with which we are all too familiar. elsewhere on the planet where the US and its proxies and vassals have been meting out this kind of violence forever. So we talk a lot about the imperial boomerang these days, this phrase that's used to describe the reality that, colonialism practiced abroad ultimately comes home as a kind of fascism. The idea that governments that use repressive techniques to oppress people in colonial territories around the world will eventually, inevitably, use those same techniques domestically against their own citizens. That's what we're seeing now. This is an idea that originates with Aimé Césaire, a Black writer and thinker from Martinique, in his very famous work, Discourse on Colonialism in 1950, where he spoke about a kind of reverse shock, or the terrific boomerang, as he called it, to explain the origins of European fascism in the first half of the 20th century. This was also an idea that was picked up by Hannah Arendt later on in what she called a boomerang effect in the origins of totalitarianism. And they said that these methods that were used by Hitler and the Nazis, those were not unique at all, except they were now being used against Europeans. All of those horrific practices and tactics were first used by the West against colonized peoples in the global South. They had done so for centuries, literally causing millions of deaths. And the U.S. was first and foremost a colonial testing ground. It was founded on the genocide of the native peoples of the Americas. It was built by enslaved Africans. It was inequitably preserved through things like Jim Crow and oligarchic capitalism. It was expanded through violent aggression against Mexico and across the continent. And then it was developed, of course, for 2 centuries through the exploitation of migrants. All of that is an extension of this colonial idea. But its imperial expansion never stopped at the borders of North America, because its violence was then exported to over 130 years across Latin America and Asia and the Pacific and the Arab world and Africa. And the same bloody US techniques that were used in the colonization of places like the Philippines and China and Puerto Rico, and the same kind of brutal tactics of aggression that were used by the US in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Syria, and beyond, all of this has been brought back home in oppressive US laws and intrusive surveillance and brutal law enforcement tactics being used inside the US that were first tested on Black and brown bodies all around the world. This is why the international human rights system, international human rights law, is universal. It says that you don't have to be a citizen to enjoy the rights of freedom from fear and freedom from want that are codified in international law, and that those can be violated anywhere. And that framework of colonialism, of imperialism, that brings racial hierarchies and mass surveillance and forced labor and mass incarceration in the US, ultimately genocide in places like Palestine these days, the militarization of the police that we see so visibly now, not just in the ICE, but very much demonstrated by ICE, the use of law enforcement specifically to brutalize communities of color and political dissidents, right? The domestic deployment of militarized police, which are military forces in the end, in equipment and tactics and so on, in response to political protests. And now this deployment of ICE as a kind of rogue paramilitary to terrorize communities, to carry out racial profiling, to inflict this kind of violence that we're seeing on video on peaceful people, and even to carry out summary executions on our streets. This is all a part of the imperial boomerang that is now coming to haunt us in our own countries and our own communities.
Well, Craig, another element of this kind of the war coming home, Trump on multiple occasions, not only now in Minnesota, but even in, previous ICE deployments to different cities, when there's been a lot of protests, he's floated the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act, in a way to just respond and clamp down on these mass mobilizations that have broken out in, again, many cities and many states against CBP and against ICE actions. So again, because you're a legal expert and international law expert, it is interesting to kind of contextualize these things that the Trump administration does in that context. What does this signal about the US state's posture towards its own population?
Well, this is interesting, and this too is a part of the imperial boomerang, because what it says is that law enforcement is not something which is deployed to protect and serve, to use a cliche that law enforcement agencies often use, but rather it conceives the targets of that law enforcement as enemies to whom violence must be done, right? So this is the difference, for example, between a military whose job it is to carry out warfare against an enemy, and law enforcement, on the other hand, who at least in principle, and we all know the history of law enforcement in the U.S. that started out as a violent and racist enterprise, but the principle behind law enforcement, civilian law enforcement, is supposed to be completely different. There's no enemy. There's no idea about going out and destroying things and killing people, as is military. That distinction has been gradually and intentionally eroded in law enforcement in the United States, in part by this imperial boomerang that we've been talking about. And it is a very structured effort to transform law enforcement in that way. And what Trump has done, because he has not invented any of these horrors, he has simply weaponized them, quite literally, for his own political and racist endeavors, right? So, the U.S. is bound by international law in theory. It is a rogue state, so it doesn't respect international law. The U.S. is a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That binding treaty defines what you can do under a declared state of emergency, and it defines what you cannot do. So things like discriminatory approaches, things like the use of force and firearms, disregard for the right to life in ways that don't meet international standards, those are prohibited even under a state of emergency that, quote, threatens the life of a nation. So the most extreme circumstances, which clearly that is not the case here. These forces have been deployed not to defend the country, but to advance a brutal racist political agenda of those who happen to be in power at the moment. And I think, Zoe, we should not miss, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this, the fact that this violent racist agenda aligns very much with the US's Israeli regime partner in Western Asia. And there you see a special kind of imperial boomerang, what I've been calling the Zionist boomerang, that has a number of particular features that explain the kind of violence that we're seeing now in the US.
Yeah, I'd actually love for you to expand on that Zionist boomerang you just mentioned, because so much of, and I want to be clear that the U.S. is not doing the ICE stuff because of Israel, but there is absolutely a partnership where it really starts with, they always start with Palestine. I mean, even last year when the ICE escalation began, when the Trump administration began, and you had Mahmoud Khalil and people like Mahmoud Khalil being kidnapped off the streets and having their visas revoked, and being put in ICE detention, it was over their activism in opposition to the genocide in Gaza. And the Marco Rubio and the Trump administration were getting the names of people to do this to from organizations like the Canary Mission, which is funded by right-wing Zionist Adam Milstein, to basically make a blacklist of students who are active against Israeli apartheid, to try to ruin their professional lives before they even begin. And now that's now been used to execute state violence against young people. And so we see these efforts to censor from the state, from corporation or from corporate media, increasingly being bought by people like Larry Ellison and run by people like Bari Weiss, and on and on and on. So sorry, now I'm just rambling about Zionism, but please, could you elaborate on the connection there?
Well, it's directly on point. You're right that the U.S. isn't doing this ICE terror only for Israel, but it is doing it also for Israel, and Israel is actually implicated directly in what ICE is doing in terrorizing communities in the US. You're right that ICE started its Trump raids in targeting people who were speaking out against the genocide in Palestine. That was very clearly the first canary in the coal mine, to bring that canary phrase back again. And remember, the US has helped to impose the fundamental violence and extreme racism of Zionism on the people of Palestine and the broader region of Western Asia for decades. It has invested all of its power and billions of dollars of its tax dollar resources in the Zionist project. And it's even gone so far in recent years to effectively merge its own intelligence and security apparatus, and now its law enforcement apparatus, with that of the Israeli regime. And I'll talk a little bit about how it's done that. But now that has come home to the US. That's the Zionist boomerang. So a sample of the kind of brutality that's been unleashed on Palestinian and Lebanese and Syrian bodies for decades is now being felt by people in the US, especially migrants and Muslims and protesters and students and human rights defenders and peace activists and anti-fascists, all of whom are perceived to be common enemies of the Israeli regime and of Trump's political project. And the tactics that come from the brutal joint US-Israeli project of repression in Palestine, which are entirely inconsistent with international human rights standards, by the way, and international law, all of that has become obvious. So you've got decades of US underwriting apartheid, surveillance, repression, and now genocide in Palestine. That's being brought home with the persecution of students and protesters and others, and migrants who have been speaking out against that. You also have the distortion of US legislation by Israel and its US government adjacent proxies in this country, some of which you mentioned. The official adoption of the IHRA definition, which was designed to silence dissent about Israel. The full suspension of the First Amendment of the US Constitution on behalf of the Israeli regime, right? Not to protect against criticism of the US government, but to protect against criticism of this oppressive foreign regime called Israel. The criminalization of speech that is critical of that regime. The proscribing of BDS, despite the fact that the Constitution guarantees a right to carry out those sorts of activities. And then here's what we're especially seeing in this Zionist boomerang and the connection of the Israel regime is the corruption of US law enforcement with a constant flow of Israeli weapons, Israeli equipment, Israeli surveillance technology, Israeli intelligence sharing, Israeli training, and influence from Israel regime proxy organizations in the US. We're talking about technology that's already notorious for its brutal use on Palestinians, militarized tactics of Israel that have been universally condemned, tactics designed, as I said, not for civilian protection, but for killing and maiming. Israel's so-called counterterrorism tactics, sounds familiar, right? Surveillance, crowd control, racial profiling, intrusive intelligence gathering, mass surveillance and data extraction technology from Israeli companies being used by ICE and other law enforcement in the US, like Celebrite and Paragon Solutions, to access our personal data. All of that is terrifying enough. But the other piece of this that brings it all home is that all of these programs, these joint programs between US and Israeli law enforcement, are also designed to export the ideology of the Israeli regime, not just weapons and technology, right? And by the way, ICE is in the center of this, as is Cop City outside of Atlanta, which is also a project in which the Israeli regime has been very, very much implicated. And what they're doing through these exchanges, they're exporting a kind of violent racist ideology, very right-wing, thoroughly Zionist, militarist, anti-human rights. And here you see this in Minnesota, deeply anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, by extension, anti-Somali as well there. And the idea that the targets of law enforcement are not a population to be served and protected, they are the enemy. They are terrorists. They're not entitled to human rights. They have to be destroyed and defeated. I get a little riled up about this, but let me just finish with this point. These programs are organized by Israel regime proxies in the United States, such as the ADL, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the American Jewish Committee. These all have Jewish names. As we all know, they're not Jewish organizations. They're Zionist organizations, proxies of the Israel regime. The charitable organizations that are affiliated with AIPAC, Birthright Israel, they are actively receiving US tax dollars in order to organize these exchanges that are indoctrinating and equipping abusive law enforcement like ICE. And so already thousands of US law enforcement officials, including high-ranking ICE and Border Patrol and FBI executives, have traveled to Israel since the 2000s for this indoctrination. And Cop City is being built as a laboratory for this ideology that is now, impacting the human rights of people across the US and across the West.
Yeah, it really is incredible, and always using Judaism as basically a human shield in many ways. Craig, I wanted to also put this to you because, we've heard nonstop. I mean, I think every 2 days, various organizations based out of North America increase the death toll in Iran by like 10,000. I think now I've seen claims that somehow like 80,000 people potentially were killed in Iran over the course of 2 days, 80,000 protesters by organizations that are pushing for a U.S. war on Iran. And the reason I raised that is because you're talking about protesters being killed, and that's a different issue. I mean, there is definitely a campaign to overly inflate numbers that are just ridiculous upon even a slight amount of scrutiny to try to sell us another regime change war. But all that's to say, I actually read an article today that officials are saying that the Trump administration is considering strikes on Iranian officials responsible for killing protesters. Meanwhile, we've got literal street executions on video of protesters in the U.S. I mean, the irony couldn't be more absurd. So I raised that to ask you, if this were happening in another country, what we've witnessed in the U.S. over the last 3 weeks, border forces killing a nurse and a legal observer during unrest, how do you think the U.S. government and human rights institutions would likely respond? What does this double standard that reveal about this entire absurd system when you can have the same people justifying a street execution, claiming to want to go bomb Iran to save Iranian protesters?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say the imperial mechanism in the United States is not limited only to the government. There are a lot of partners that are structurally a part of this sort of imperial propaganda, right? We haven't spoken about corporate media in the United States, which has never met an act of aggression or a genocide abroad that it wasn't all for, if the perpetrators were aligned with the U.S. Empire. And we saw that again with regard to Iran. And so we shouldn't be surprised, or the U.S. empire. You are not making an argument based upon morals, principles, international human rights, or international law. You are a part of the problem. And I think people really have to be very careful. These allegations about casualties, there is a methodology for identifying in the wake of unrest actual casualties that have been developed by real human rights monitors and investigators. One of the things it requires is verification, because you always get this kind of misrepresentation, especially by those who want to weaponize the idea of human rights in order to justify greater human rights violations in their own actions, like aggression. And the U.S. government is infamous for trying to do this. There's also the issue of disaggregation. So we saw this a lot in Syria, where people would just sort of quote the number of people who had been lost in the war in Syria, but not identify who they were or who the perpetrators were, what actually happened. And in Iran, of course, we know that the government has said that many Iranians, innocent Iranians, Iranian civilians, or Iranian law enforcement, people associated with the regime, people opposed to the regime, were killed in an orgy of violence that broke out there, not all perpetrated by the government, but by other actors as well. Which of those were the victims of, what are the actual numbers? Which were the victims of external perpetrators, U.S. and Israeli intelligence operatives, armed groups opposed to the government, criminal gangs, and government actors. That's what disaggregation is. You determine what it is. But anytime you hear somebody trying to weaponize the idea of human rights in order to create bigger violations, and the ultimate violation of human rights would be an attack on Iran that killed people, that stripped the Iranians of self-determination and put in place a regime that instead was operating in the interest of the United States and the Israeli regime and others, which or tries to restore an authoritarian monarchist regime that would do the bidding of a foreign regime. That is not an argument about the human rights of the Iranian people. That's an argument about the agendas of others who don't give a damn about the human rights of the Iranian people, or as we've said, the Syrian people, the Lebanese people, or anybody else. And the last time you interviewed me, Rania, you made me swear on this subject. These people should
But it was righteous. It was righteous.
Yeah, they should keep human rights out of their effing mouth. And I think that's really what applies. Well,
yes, no, I appreciate that. Look, I like when the swear words come out sparingly, because I think it really demonstrates the outrage we're all feeling. Craig Mokhiber, I want to thank you so much for joining us and so articulately breaking all of this down. I really appreciate it.
Always an honor to be with both of you. Thanks so much, Rania and Zoe.
Thank you.
Well, Zoe,
We're a rogue
I'm
state,
glad that we
Rania.
could do.
Turns out.
Yeah. We're what?
We're a rogue state. We're a failed state now.
Oh, we are. I know.
The
I
US.
mean, like I said, the U.S. is not okay. The U.S. is not okay. Go to therapy. In all seriousness, I'm really glad that we're able to touch on all of these topics. And before we go to our next guest, I just want to remind everybody that Breakthrough News is an independent media outlet. We are able to bring you guests like Craig and Meghdad, and who we're going to bring on next, and bring you independent, truthful, accurate news and analysis because we are independent. So please help us continue to go and grow by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. I also believe we have a GoFundMe going right now, specifically to help fundraise for our coverage in Minneapolis. You all may have noticed that we were live streaming the general strike in Minneapolis. Was it last Friday or Saturday, I think? I can't remember exactly which day, but it was over the weekend. Friday. And I believe we were like basically the main outlet doing that. Nobody had drone footage quite as good as ours showing those masses of people that were striking that day in the streets. We're able to do that because of support from you all. So we have a GoFundMe if you want to continue to support our correspondents like Zoe, Alexandra being in the field. God, you poor thing, Zoe. I saw her eyelashes frozen. It is cold over there. It is very, very cold in Minneapolis right now. So braving the cold, braving the tear gas. Zoe was, after Alex Pretti's murder, was giving us updates from the ground with tear gas all around her. I don't know what was worse, the tear gas or the cold, but help support. Go ahead, Zoe. Go ahead. Which was worse?
The cold. I wiped out and I have an injury. So
Oh, right. Yes, Zoe fell.
the cold is brutal, guys. It's no joke.
Okay. Well, so we can help keep Zoe and others warm. But no, because we want to be able to bring you these really important moments of collective activism. Please go to our patreon.com/breakthrough news, and then also consider going to our GoFundMe, which I believe we can put in the live chat. I'm going to throw that to our production staff to do. And on that note, I am going to go ahead and introduce our next guest. We have with us Simon Elliott, a community activist in Minneapolis. Simon, thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, Rania. Good afternoon, Zoe. It's an honor to be on the show.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. You have been in the streets as this movement unfolds. So can you just start off by telling us, what are you seeing right now in Minneapolis? And how has the energy changed? I guess first I would say since the general strike, but then again, after that, since the killing of Alex Pretti.
Absolutely. I think it's important in order to answer that question, to give a little bit of the context of what we've been experiencing here in the Twin Cities. Starting December 1st, the Operation Metro Surge, the Trump administration, which had been going from city to city across the nation, Chicago, Portland, New Orleans, decided to focus on Minneapolis and focus on the Twin Cities. And within a few weeks, it was announced near Christmas, actually, that the Trump administration would be sending upwards of 3,000 federal agents to the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And just to give a comparison of what it feels like, at the peak of operations in Chicago, there were 300 agents, and that's a metropolitan area of around 10 million. And in the Twin Cities, there were 3,000 agents, ICE, CBP, HSI, and the Twin Cities Metro is close to 4 million. And I live and work in South Minneapolis, and everywhere you go, you see CBP, you see ICE, you see convoys, you see community members with their whistles, with their car horns, alerting other community members to the presence of ICE in our community. And so it really, for weeks, we saw the community organize in very organic ways, each neighborhood figuring out how they were going to communicate with each other in order to make sure that as many community members immigrant or not, were kept safe from this campaign of terror that the Trump administration has unleashed here on the streets of the Twin Cities. And so we saw like there's so much fear in the immigrant community. And I say that, know a lot of people who have been directly impacted by deportations or who have not been able to go to work or who have pulled their kids out of school because of the fear of pickup and drop-offs, both for themselves as parents, but also for their children. And so despite all that fear, and despite the fact that the Trump administration was really hitting hard on Minneapolis to try to set an example, to make an example of the Twin Cities, what we saw last Friday, January 23rd, was really a historic event. More than 100,000 people poured into the streets of downtown Minneapolis. Businesses shut down across the cities, across the state. And it really, sent waves of energy, waves of a spirit of a fight back, of people across the cities saying, we are united, whether from the Somali community, the Latino community, the Hmong community in St. Paul, immigrant or not, we were all united in the streets to send a very clear message, a very powerful message, demanding that ICE leave the Twin Cities, and also demanding that ICE leave every city across the entire United States. And it was a full rejection of every part of Trump's racist billionaire agenda.
Yeah, I think that momentum is really contagious and really exciting. And I think that's why so many people have been looking to Minneapolis. We have to remember, of course, that Minneapolis and the Twin Cities were the kind of the springboard for the 2020 national rebellion against racism. And in a lot of ways, what we're seeing now is once again a rebellion against racism, a rebellion against xenophobia, and against this terror on the communities in Minneapolis, but across the nation. Can you talk a bit more about how that energy is being carried forward? It's notable that the execution of Alex Pretti took place, within 12 hours, really, after people had, packed up, after being in negative, I think in Fahrenheit, it's negative 10 degrees, and in Celsius, it's negative 30 degrees for our international people marching on the streets, and someone was executed by the same, force that people are demanding get out of the city. How is the energy from Friday carried forward in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities? And do you see it spreading to a more national scale?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, we cannot forget to mention the negative 15 with wind chill. It might have even been colder on Friday. And that does not stop the people of Minnesota. And it has never stopped us before, and it won't stop us moving forward. Yeah, after Friday's historic day, there was so much energy that day, that night. And then we all woke up the next morning, and within hours, like you said, Zoe, we saw the cold-blooded execution-style murder of Alex Pretti in the streets of Minneapolis. And whether that was by design or by coincidence, certainly the Trump administration and using CBP and using ICE, they want the community to be afraid, and they want the community to cower. They do not want the community to be brave in the way that we have of being on the streets as observers, creating community networks to meet the needs of our immigrant community members. And the community has responded here in the Twin Cities, responded with rage, certainly, and grief, but immediately channeled that energy as a doubling down in the streets and a doubling down of those community members. And for every Renee Nicole Good who was murdered, also very close to where Alex Pretti was then later murdered, for every Renee and Alex, there's tens of thousands of other people who are brave and standing face to face with ICE agents, standing face to face with CBP agents. Wherever Bovino goes, he's met with people with whistles and people with choice words for him and his agents. And within minutes, and I think Zoe, yeah, you were on the ground reporting, there were thousands of people on the intersection, 26 and Nicollet, where the assassination happened. That night, there was a vigil and rally that started a couple blocks away and marched to the site of the assassination. There were people in the street until late that night, chanting, holding space, and talking about that we will stay in the streets and we will redouble our efforts to say ICE out of Minnesota. And I think it's also important to note that the next day we had more than 10,000 people again in the streets of Minneapolis. Again, the temperature sub-zero, but that did not stop people from demonstrating their rage and demonstrating a really clear message that what I said before, which is the Trump administration is trying to make an example of Minneapolis. And I don't think that there's any coincidence, like you said, Zoe, that Minneapolis was the epicenter of people's struggle in 2020. And now here in 2026, it's the epicenter once again of the struggle for immigrants' rights and the fight back against Trump's racist campaigns of terror across the country. And so the energy here, pardon me, the energy here in the Twin Cities, it stays very high. It continues to be, people are demanding that we continue to push towards shutting it down across the country, both, here in Minnesota and across the country. And we've seen calls, it's been incredible for all of us in Minneapolis to see the amount of solidarity that there is. And also there's movement towards this example they've tried to make and how the movement here responded with setting the model of the general strike, the model of the statewide shutdown that we saw on January 23rd. We're now seeing those calls echoed in every corner across the United States. And under the banner of solidarity with Minneapolis, solidarity with Minnesota, shut it down. And so I think that the Trump administration clearly is starting to backpedal, starting to, they've announced that Bovino, he's supposed to be leaving today if he has not left already. And undetermined exactly how many CBP agents are going with him, but there's an announcement that some CBP agents will be leaving with him. And they're sending in Tom Homan to Minnesota to manage the situation on the ground. So we in Minnesota, we're very proud to have defeated Trump's #1 attack dog in Bovino. But the struggle does not stop there. We know that it's not just a Bovino problem, it's not just a CBP problem. And the people in Minnesota, that the tone is one that we will continue to fight until it is all of ICE and all of Trump's agenda that are defeated, not just here in Minnesota, but across the entire nation.
I wanted to ask you, because this escalation in Minneapolis began with ICE specifically targeting the Somali community, fueled by these racist conspiracy theories pushed by the Trump administration. But it's interesting because the two people who've been executed on camera, murdered on camera by ICE, have been white Americans, like American citizens, right? So I'm just curious if that dynamic has led to a change in the way people perceive ICE and CP and the Customs and Border Enforcement and the Trump administration as more of a threat to everyone rather than just, immigrants or undocumented people from these brown countries. I think before that is how a lot of people viewed immigration enforcement, even if they thought, they didn't like the way it worked. It's like if you have American citizenship, and especially if you're like a white American, it's not really seen as something that could ever be used against you.
Yeah, absolutely. It has united the working people of Minneapolis against Trump. And it started with the Somali community with very racist comments that Trump made in late November. And then you two are journalists. I don't want to use the word journalists for some of the clowns that were on the ground here in Minneapolis
Fair.
doing supposed journalism, trying to expose fraud in Minneapolis, and some videos that went viral on right-wing Twitter and that caught the attention of the Trump administration to send more agents, more of a federal presence here to go after this supposed fraud. And the Trump administration, so it started, like you said, with the Somali community, but then quickly with hundreds and then later thousands of federal agents in the streets, we saw it really spread. And we saw it to there was the majority of detentions were hitting the Latino community here. And then, as you said, the community members who would see ICE in their neighborhood and go outside with a whistle, the response from CBP and ICE was brutal, and it continues to be brutal. Shooting tear gas in residential neighborhoods very indiscriminately, shocking videos that Breakthrough and other outlets have brought to light of ICE agents dragging people out of their cars, smashing windows, pushing people off of their bikes, pushing people who are just simply walking by while ICE is attempting to do an abduction in their neighborhood. So it really activated a lot of people who maybe 2 months ago would not have considered themselves part of the immigrant rights movement. And then most recently, I think it's very important to note as well the other subsets or the other sectors of our community who've also been activated. There was a story, a video and photos came out of ICE dragging a man who I believe it turned out that he was a citizen, but an older Hmong man in St. Paul. In, again, sub-zero temperatures, they took him out of his house in no shoes, wearing nothing but underwear and a robe, and walked him to the car, detained him, and then ended up releasing him hours later. But those sort of scenes that activated the Hmong community we've seen. And then later, just I think about last Monday, after a demonstration at a church in St. Paul, where some local organizers and activists discovered that one of the pastors is a field director for ICE here locally. And we can point out the hypocrisy there for a long time, but he is a pastor and an ICE field director. And so some people went to the church during Sunday service to just point out the hypocrisy. And the next day, the Trump administration, the DOJ, arrested and announced charges against 2 Black women who had led that protest. And the response then from the Black community in Minneapolis was, and I heard you say we'll use swear words sparingly on this show, so I won't quote directly, but it was certainly one of rage and one of, you are impacting this entire community, Latino, Somali, Hmong, Black. And so the Trump administration really is now seeing what it looks like and what it feels like to have an entire city. And I think we're starting to really see the seeds of an entire nation that's united against their agenda and against their tactics.
Well, yes, indeed. And we see calls, spreading calls for shutdowns. There's like a general call for a shutdown on Friday. You've got various schools and states across the country saying they're going to, organizing walkouts against ICE, and increasingly more happening. We hear calls from celebrities for some sort of general strike. So this is certainly a developing movement, and definitely coming out of Minneapolis and spreading across the country. Simon Elliott, community activist in Minneapolis, thank you so much for joining us and breaking all of this down. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. We'll see you soon.
Well, Zoe, before we wrap here, there's something I want to talk to you about. I know you're cold, and your hand hurts because you fell in the cold, because you're in Minneapolis. That's why you're cold, not because you're sick, I hope. But I want to, before we wrap, I want to talk about something that I've been noticing for the second round, and that is the reaction from the sort of like MAGA, I don't want to use the word intellectuals because that's like too generous a term, MAGA influencers, let's call them MAGA influencers. They have been so excited justifying this murder, celebrating this murder. I mean, if you didn't already see the fascist mask slip, please allow yourself to see that slip now. And the reason I raise this is because there has been an attempt to frame certain MAGA influencers as people we should ally with because, you know, they're criticizing Israel. And I want to be clear here. I'm talking about the sort of like MAGA officials and influencers. I'm not talking about people who may be misled. I think it's always important to engage in that battle of ideas, to try to bring people to our side across the political spectrum, average working class people. A lot of them have the views they have because they're surrounded by a tsunami of propaganda. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the charlatan millionaires who are fake populists. Their right-wing populism is fake. It is to make money. And I want to show an example of what I'm talking about. Can we please pull up that Megyn Kelly clip? I'm going to give John a second to pull it up.
I know I'm supposed to feel sorry for Alex Pretti, but I don't. I don't. Do you know why I wasn't shot by Border Patrol this weekend? Because I kept my ass inside and out of their operations. It's very simple. If I felt strongly enough about something the government was doing that I would go out and protest, I would do it peacefully on the sidewalk without interfering via a whistle, via shouting, via my body, via any other way. I would make my objections known by standing there without interfering, because interfering is where you go south. And laying hands on a police officer trying to, or Border Patrol officer or ICE officer trying to conduct a law enforcement operation is a felony. And now you are going to get arrested. And if you do anything that resembles resisting, you're in serious trouble.
She's a fascist. She watched the same video that we watched. She saw this man get shot 10 times for not resisting anything. He was totally subdued for no reason, by the way, by a gang of thugs. And he was executed in broad daylight on camera. We have several different angles of it. And she's justifying it. She's excusing it because MAGA did it. Because she is a multimillionaire charlatan. Maybe not so much a charlatan. She's a multimillionaire MAGA influencer. And that's her cult. That's the cult she belongs to. And she will justify any murder, any war carried out by this administration, because that is what she serves. Okay, I want people to focus on what she said, because it's the same kind of rhetoric from Nick Fuentes, same kind of rhetoric from Mike Cernovich, same, and on and on and on. These people are not your friends. And I think a lot of our audience knows they're not our friends, but I even mean, like, I do not care if these people criticize Israel. I don't care, because even the way they criticize Israel, Zoe, is stupid. It's not even accurate. They criticize Israel because it's not America first. It's like a stupid analysis. If that's your analysis, that the problem with Israel, with supporting Israel, is it's not America first, what is America first to you? America first is executing people in the street for having dissenting opinions? Because you know what, Zoe, if you or I, or people who watch Breakthrough News, or people who watch like CNN, forget even like the left, you know, your average person that opposes Trump's border policies or immigrant policies or a war here or there is killable to these people, because they are fascists. And when they say America first, they still support imperialism. These people don't understand Israel in the context of imperialism. I'm perfectly happy with them to have their little fight about Israel within the right. I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to be a part of it because at the end of the day, the problem isn't just Israel. The problem isn't Israel, it's imperialism. It's American imperialism, which is what Israel represents. And America makes Gazas all over the world. And so, look, I want to free Palestine. I don't think these MAGA influencers are going to free Palestine. But let's say, like, you got rid of Israel tomorrow. What kind of free Palestine is that if you still have imperialism across the Middle East? because all these people support Trump's war on Iran. All these people, the MAGA cult, supported Trump's kidnapping of a sitting president in Venezuela and taking Venezuela's oil. I mean, Matt Taibbi, who's basically like MAGA now, was going on saying our biggest mistake was we didn't take Iraq's oil. That was our biggest mistake in Iraq. That's America first. America first is still stealing resources from the global south and killing anybody who doesn't agree. So
And by the
these
way,
people are not our friends. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry. Now I'm
no, just that America first with Palestine is Trump ruling Gaza. It's not. I mean, it's Trump and Tony Blair ruling Gaza, and it's I mean, that's the clearest example of what that actually means. But it is disgusting, and it's really, I mean, there's so many things to say about that clip, Rania, but I just want to bring it back to this like human aspect, and also the fact that, CBP and ICE are essentially violating every single law that exists. I mean, every single court order, basic humanitarian law, they're not respecting any laws. They're terrorizing communities. They're arresting 5-year-olds. They're dragging people out of their house. They're beating citizens. They're executing citizens. So if they are breaking every single law, do they have legitimacy as a law enforcement agency? I don't think so. And so the fact that that someone sees a woman getting beat by officers and tries to intervene, you can't argue, well, he's violating their operations. What operations? To terrorize communities? Like they shouldn't be given a free pass to kidnap people, beat them, and shoot them. And so, there's an aspect of like what laws, and I think it extends to the broader Trump administration and Trump himself. It's like, how are you saying that people can't, they deserve to be shot because they weren't following the law when Trump violates every single law? Trump officials, their forces are not respecting any law, but then you use that same argument to say that those people should be shot. And on a human level, when you're someone who has a basic ounce of empathy and you see someone being beat up by a bully, it is a human response to try to protect that person. I'd like to think, although I hope to never be in that situation, I'd like to think I would also try to intervene and protect someone. And, the response should never be getting shot by agents that are armed to the teeth. I mean, again, as we said, like I was out there on Saturday morning and, they had created a perimeter using both state police and local police who themselves, Wald, sorry, Frey, but these agents, local, ordered by Democrats, were also armed to the teeth and repressing citizens and community members that were opposing an execution. So we're getting to the point where, what does it mean? What does law and order mean in this country? And, the right thing to do is to protect the community and to defend innocent people who are being beaten by reckless, thugs. And so I think it's just horrific to see that kind of argument used. I like to think, and especially from being here, I think that the reality is that most people see it for what it is. These MAGA people don't actually speak for a large section of the population. When they say America first, they're saying us and our billionaire friends, because, this idea of the white American that they're supposedly trying to protect is also not true. Which white Americans exist in their mind that they want to like save the nation for? Because it's not Alex Pretti, it's not Renee Good. So what is this idea of America first? What are these white Christians that they're so worried about, getting extinct? Because the reality is the United States is a diverse, it is a multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, diverse religions. It is that country, and the fabric, just again, like I've been really moved to see the mood on the ground in Minnesota. It is a place that is diverse, where people love their neighbors, where people are, offering a helping hand, where they've organized these community patrols to keep their neighbors safe. Like that is hopefully the future of this country, not one where there's this narrow idea of who counts as Americans, because again, like they're literally only speaking about them and their little billionaire friends. None of us are included in that. Literally none of us.
Yeah.
And I think the sooner that people realize that, the sooner that, we're again, that gets us into but like the sooner there's more unity amongst the people and realizing that it is us versus them. It's us versus these fascist billionaires.
Actually, who have like fascist billionaires who have millionaire influencers propagandizing for them. I'm so happy though, and this is going to sound very corny what I'm about to say, but I really do genuinely, like from the heart, mean it. People like Megyn Kelly and like JD Vance and like that whole MAGA crowd, they think that people like us like just hate America, right? We just hate America, so all we do is hate America. I mean, I hate American empire. I hate the American military industrial complex and what it does to people around the world. I hate the atrocities America commits at home and abroad. I actually love the part of the US that you just described. I love the collective unity that has existed throughout American history, that has had several uprisings and revolutions to make things better. That is like the part of American history, to bring up Howard Zinn's A People's History of the US. It's about both genocide, but also about the movements we don't learn about in American history that gave us the kinds of rights we have today that Trump is trying to take away. I actually really appreciate and love that part of US history, of the resistance to US colonialism, slavery, empire that continues. And I think the spirit of that exists in the movement we see rising up in Minneapolis and increasingly spreading across the country. And it's just honestly out of human nature, like you said. Alex Pretti, Renee Good, that could have been me and you. Like, I would like to think I would intervene if I saw somebody getting bullied or hurt. I would intervene and be a legal observer if I could, or be the journalist on the ground. Or if I felt like I could without getting killed, like intervene, because Alex Pretti was trying to help a woman who was getting pushed by ICE. So these are like really good, heroic people carrying out acts of the average person who isn't a sociopath, which I would like to think most people aren't. All that's to say, we have reached the end of our program. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and remind you once again, if you haven't already, make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And if you can, please do go to patreon.com/breakthrough-news and consider becoming a paying member. For as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. And most importantly, you can be a part of independent media that is bringing you the truth about what's happening in the world, both domestically and internationally. Lots of people don't like what we're saying here at Breakthrough News because they're funded by Rupert Murdoch. Wink, wink at you who's probably watching us. You know who you are. That Fox News investigative reporter who keeps like watching our tweets. Investigative reporters obviously.
It's not investigative. It's not investigative. You just like collect tweets and then put them. I mean,
public tweets. Never, like that.
As of now, I'm not an investigative journalist, and I'm good at collecting tweets. Someday. If you're watching, we're talking about you. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this episode of Breakthrough Live. We will be back. Zoe will be hosting again with me on Thursday. Eugene's traveling this week. We'll be back at noon Eastern time on Thursday. I can't speak. Thursday. With you got the Minnesota virus.
Yeah. Bringing you more incredible guests to talk about the news stories of the week. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you next time.